Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you might completely flip the way you see no contact. You probably heard it 1,000 times. Go no contact. Walk away. Don't chase. But most people don't really understand what's actually happening inside the mind of the avoidant when you do. They think the avoidant doesn't care. They think silence doesn't touch them. But the truth, it cuts deeper than you imagine. Avoidants are masters of control. They live in a world where emotions are a threat and closeness feels like danger. Their armor is distance. Their weapon is silence. They've built that armor brick by brick, year after year, protecting themselves from rejection, judgment, or pain. And when you go no contact, when you step back and stop reaching out, that armor starts to crack. At first, they feel relief. They think, finally, space, peace. But what they don't realize is that your silence doesn't just give them space. It gives them a mirror that reflects back everything they've been running from. Suddenly, the noise quiets down, and for the first time, they can hear their own thoughts, their own fears, their own emptiness. See, when you were in their life, even through conflict, your energy was there. You were the anchor that grounded their chaos. Your presence gave them the illusion of connection without forcing them to face their vulnerability. But once you go silent, the illusion shatters, and now they're left with the very thing they've been avoiding their entire lives themselves. Your silence becomes louder than words. Every unanswered message, every day you don't reach out, it hits their nervous system differently. It doesn't feel like rejection, it feels like loss. Not the loss of control, but the loss of safety. Because as much as they crave independence, deep down they crave connection too. They just don't know how to hold it without fear of losing it. And this is where the shift begins. No contact forces an avoidant to confront their emotional truth, the truth that they cared more than they admitted, that the person they pushed away was the one who saw through their walls, that the person they thought they didn't need was the one they actually did. Now, I'm not saying you go no contact to manipulate them. That's not the point. You go no contact to heal yourself, to reclaim your power. But in doing that, something incredible happens. You stop feeding their avoidance. You stop chasing their validation. And suddenly they feel the imbalance. For the first time, they're the ones feeling the void. Because here's the reality: when you stop trying to fix someone, they're forced to sit with the broken pieces. When you stop running after love, the one who ran from it begins to notice the absence of your presence. No contact doesn't punish an avoidant, it awakens them. It pulls them out of the fog of denial. It's the silence that speaks what words never could. It says, I love you enough to let you go, but I love myself enough not to chase you anymore. That's when the real transformation happens for both of you. They start to feel what connection actually meant. They start to realize that space without love isn't freedom, it's loneliness. That the peace they thought they wanted isn't peace at all, it's emptiness. So yes, no contact hurts avoidance. But not because you're gone, it's because through your absence, they finally see the truth. The truth that your love was real, that your presence had value, that your energy mattered. And you through your silence, reclaim your worth. You stop proving, explaining, or begging. You let your absence do what your presence never could, create clarity. So if you're walking that hard road of no contact right now, don't doubt your decision. Don't break the silence just to ease the discomfort. You're not being cruel. You're creating space for growth. You're allowing both hearts to heal in the only way they can, through stillness. Remember this, your silence is not weakness, it's power. It's strength, it's healing in motion. And for the avoidant, it's the one thing they never saw coming. The moment they realize the person they thought would always be there finally isn't. That's when change begins. That's when growth begins. That's when the story shifts from pain to power, from fear to freedom. Silence is the mirror that exposes what they've been avoiding. It's not just quiet, it's truth made audible. When you step back, when you finally stop explaining, arguing, defending, or chasing, something powerful happens in that silence. The avoidant, who spent their life running from emotional intensity, suddenly comes face to face with the very thing they've built walls to escape. Because silence doesn't just remove you, it removes their shield. It removes the noise, the distraction, the chaos that's kept them from seeing themselves. For the first time, they feel the stillness of their own mind, and in that stillness, the reflection begins. An avoidant often believes they're safer alone. They think distance means peace. They think shutting down is control. But that's just survival programming. They've spent years teaching themselves that emotions equal danger, that attachment equals pain, that love equals loss. So they avoid, they minimize, they withdraw. They tell themselves they're fine without closeness. And when you're there constantly reaching out, they can keep believing that story. They can convince themselves that they're not disconnected, they're independent, they're not cold, they're just private. But when you pull back, when the calls stop, when the messages stop, when your energy no longer fills their world, that's when the illusion starts to fade. Silence becomes the mirror that forces them to see the cracks in their armor. They can't distract themselves with your words anymore. They can't soothe their guilt with your reassurance. The silence makes them notice the tension in their chest, the restless thoughts that won't stop, the quiet ache that rises every night. They start to wonder why peace suddenly feels like discomfort. Why distance, which once felt safe, now feels like emptiness. The silence begins to echo, and what it echoes is truth. Truth about what they feel, what they fear, and what they've been pretending not to need. Avoidants don't hate connection. They fear it. They crave love deeply, but are terrified of depending on it. That's why silence is so powerful. It doesn't attack them. It exposes them. It holds up a mirror to the contradictions they've been living with. The part of them that wants to be seen starts fighting with the part that's terrified of exposure. The part that wants closeness wrestles with the part that fears abandonment. And with every day of silence, that inner war gets louder. They might appear calm, detached, indifferent on the surface, but inside, there's a storm brewing. They start to replay memories. They think about what you said, how you looked at them, the things you did that no one else ever did. They start noticing the difference between your energy and the emptiness around them now. Silence becomes a teacher. It teaches them what presence really felt like. It makes them realize that the peace they thought they had in solitude was actually avoidance in disguise. They begin to sense that your absence isn't just silence. It's reflection. It's the sound of accountability. It's the space where they can't hide from themselves anymore. When you go quiet, you stop being part of their pattern. Their subconscious expects you to fill the silence, to reach out, to chase, to prove your care again and again. But when you don't, you break the pattern. You interrupt their sense of emotional control, and suddenly they're the ones left waiting for a message that never comes, waiting for reassurance that isn't there. That waiting turns into anxiety, and that anxiety turns into self-awareness. They start asking themselves, why does this bother me? Why do I miss something I said I didn't need? That's the beginning of emotional awakening, the moment when avoidance starts to collide with truth. In that collision, they begin to see themselves not as untouchable, but as human. They begin to understand that their detachment isn't power, it's fear. That silence, which they once used to protect themselves, now becomes the very thing that reveals their vulnerability. It's no longer comfortable, it's confronting. They feel the absence not as punishment, but as presence. Your absence becomes a presence in itself. Every quiet moment is a reminder of what they've lost. Every night without your energy becomes a reflection of what connection truly meant. Silence teaches them that connection isn't suffocation, it's life. They start to understand that the walls they built weren't keeping pain out, they were keeping love out too. And as they begin to see that, the silence turns into a mirror reflecting back every missed opportunity, every unspoken word. Every time they chose distance over understanding, the mind starts to replay those decisions like scenes in a movie, and slowly awareness starts to grow. They realize that silence doesn't protect them anymore. It reveals them. It forces them to face the loneliness that's been hiding behind their independence. And that's where transformation begins, not through confrontation, not through arguments, but through quiet, through the stillness that no one can escape. Because silence doesn't lie. It reflects reality exactly as it is. And for the avoidant, that reality is often a hard one. They cared more than they admitted. They needed more than they allowed. And now they're left with a mirror showing them exactly what they've been avoiding all along. No contact breaks their illusion of control. Avoidants thrive on the belief that they are untouchable, that they can navigate relationships on their terms without being affected by others' emotions. They construct a carefully curated sense of independence, a fortress built from years of self-protection, distance, and detachment. They tell themselves that needing someone is weakness, that expressing emotions is risky, that attachment will only lead to disappointment. In their minds, maintaining control over themselves and over the boundaries of their relationships is not just survival, it's power. And so they operate from a place of carefully maintained distance, keeping people close enough to serve their needs, but far enough to avoid vulnerability. But when you initiate no contact, that carefully maintained illusion begins to crumble. For so long, the avoidant has been navigating a world where they set the terms, where they dictate the pace and intensity of emotional connection. They are the ones who decide when to show affection, when to withdraw, when to open up, and when to close off. The illusion of control is comforting because it allows them to believe that they are the masters of their emotional world. They may not admit it, even to themselves, but control has been their safe haven. When you step back, when you cease communication, when you refuse to be pulled into their rhythm, the very foundation of that illusion is challenged. Suddenly there's a force outside of their control. You are no longer responding on their timeline, no longer available to soothe them, no longer filling the gaps they've created for themselves. This absence is jarring because it removes the predictability that they've relied on. The pattern they've grown accustomed to, the push, the pull, the chase, the retreat, is disrupted. They can no longer rely on the script that has allowed them to feel in control without truly confronting their emotions. Avoidants often believe that they control situations through emotional detachment. They avoid deep conversations, they resist intimacy, and they distance themselves at the first sign of perceived neediness or closeness. This detachment gives them a sense of security. They believe they are unaffected, untouchable, unshakable. But no contact interferes with that sense of security. It removes the comfort of predictability, the illusion that they can manipulate outcomes simply by withdrawing or ignoring. Now, there's a vacuum, and vacuums demand to be filled not with avoidance, but with awareness. In the absence of contact, avoidants are forced to confront the impact of their behavior. They begin to notice the void your absence creates, the space in their life that they can no longer fill with superficial distractions. They start to recognize patterns they had long dismissed or rationalized. They may try to ignore it at first, telling themselves that your silence doesn't matter, that your presence was never significant. But the truth persists, quietly asserting itself. Your absence, your refusal to participate in their game of control, begins to generate a subtle but persistent tension that they cannot ignore. No contact disrupts their emotional equilibrium. It removes the safety net of being able to engage or disengage at will. It forces them to acknowledge that someone they underestimated, someone they may have taken for granted, has reclaimed their own power. And when they realize this, they feel it in a way that words alone could never communicate. It's not just about missing you. It's about the loss of the leverage they believed they had. The familiar dynamic that allowed them to feel safe in detachment no longer exists, and that absence profoundly destabilizing. This destabilization can manifest in different ways. Some avoidants experience a rising anxiety they do not understand. They feel tension in situations that previously caused them no concern. They may begin to question their choices, replay interactions in their mind, or become preoccupied with what they perceive as your silence. Others may feel a growing emotional restlessness, a sense of imbalance that they cannot fix by withdrawing or asserting control. And some may feel a strange mix of relief and discomfort, the relief that they are not being pushed, and the discomfort that the push they once ignored is gone entirely, leaving them alone with their own thoughts and feelings. No contact does not function as punishment. It functions as a reset. It interrupts the patterns of avoidance, detachment, and emotional deflection. It creates a situation where the avoidant can no longer rely on their old strategies to maintain comfort and control. They are confronted with a new reality in which they are not the orchestrator, not the one who determines the emotional temperature, not the one who decides when the connection will resume. Instead, they are faced with absence, unpredictability, and the undeniable fact that someone they thought could be controlled has chosen autonomy. This is why no contact is so effective, not because it seeks to manipulate or coerce, but because it reveals the illusions the avoidant has constructed around themselves. It forces them to recognize that control was never truly theirs to begin with. Control, they begin to see, is not about pushing others away or maintaining distance. Control is the ability to navigate emotions honestly, to confront discomfort, and to engage with connection without fear. No contact exposes the gap between their perceived control and the reality of their emotional experience, and that gap can be both unsettling and enlightening. Avoidants often resist this recognition at first. They may rationalize, distract themselves, or double down on distance. They may convince themselves that your absence doesn't matter, that independence is preferable to connection, that they are stronger alone. But the longer the silence persists, the more undeniable the truth becomes. Patterns they relied upon to maintain their sense of power are interrupted. Their usual tactics to maintain emotional detachment fail to produce the familiar comfort. They begin to experience a subtle but profound shift, the realization that what they thought was control was actually avoidance, and that what they believed was freedom was actually limitation. No contact ultimately challenges the avoidant to grow not by force but by circumstance. It forces a confrontation with reality, the reality that connection cannot be controlled in the way they thought it could. That absence carries weight, and that emotions they avoided must be acknowledged if they are to move forward. It strips away the illusion that detachment equals mastery. It presents them with a mirror they cannot look away from, showing the consequences of avoidance and the value of authentic presence. By breaking their illusion of control, no contact does more than disrupt. It awakens. It forces an awareness that was previously unavailable, an understanding that detachment and avoidance are not strengths but limitations. It encourages reflection, introspection, and the gradual recognition that true emotional mastery comes not from control, but from courage, the courage to face feelings, the courage to embrace connection, the courage to risk vulnerability. Through this disruption, the avoidant begins to see the limits of their strategies and the depth of their own emotional landscape, realizing that what they once believed was power was only a protective illusion, and that the absence they now face is the first step toward understanding the true nature of connection. Your absence triggers their deepest fear, emotional loss. Avoidants may act as though they don't care, as though separation means nothing, but beneath the detached exterior lies an unspoken terror of losing something real. This fear doesn't always appear as sadness or longing. It often shows up as restlessness, irritability, or a deep unease they can't name. For the avoidant, emotional loss is not just about the person. They fear the experience of vulnerability that loss brings. They fear the feeling of being exposed, of realizing they cared more than they wanted to admit. So when you go silent, when you pull back completely, it doesn't just remove your presence. It awakens the fear they've buried for years. Avoidants spend their lives trying to avoid pain by avoiding attachment. Somewhere in their past, they learned that closeness comes with a cost, that love can turn into loss without warning, and that needing someone only leads to hurt. So they construct their identities around independence. They convince themselves that they're safer alone, that feelings are weakness, that emotional distance equals strength. But deep inside, they still crave connection. They still want to be seen, understood, and loved. The contradiction between what they want and what they fear is the silent battle that defines them. And when you step away, when you stop chasing, when you no longer provide the comfort of consistency, that contradiction explodes. At first, they may feel relieved. They may even convince themselves that your silence means peace. They'll say they needed space, that they're better on their own, that the relationship was too much. But that relief doesn't last, because soon after, the silence begins to stretch. And in that quiet space, the avoidant starts to feel something they can't explain. It's not immediate, it's gradual. The absence begins to echo. The comfort they once felt in isolation becomes a discomfort they can't turn off. The moments that used to bring calm now bring confusion. The world feels emptier, quieter, colder. They don't always recognize it as loss. They often experience it as agitation or frustration. But that's what loss looks like when you've spent a lifetime avoiding emotions. It disguises itself as everything else. What they're really feeling is the awakening of their deepest fear, the fear that they've lost something meaningful and can't get it back. Your absence forces them to confront what they've been running from, the truth that connection matters, that love matters, that your presence meant safety in ways they never admitted. It's not just that you're gone, it's that your energy, your stability, your emotional availability has vanished. For someone used to controlling closeness, that loss feels destabilizing. It shakes their sense of security. They start to realize that all the distance they created doesn't protect them from pain. It creates it. Avoidants have trained themselves to suppress their emotions so effectively that even when they feel loss, they don't recognize it. They try to rationalize it, to think their way through it, to turn emotion into logic. They might say, it's for the best, or I just need time to focus on myself, or it wouldn't have worked anyway. These are defenses, mental shields that protect them from acknowledging what they truly feel. But silence dismantles those defenses over time. Each day that goes by without contact chips away at the wall they've built. The mind can rationalize, but the body remembers. The nervous system reacts. The absence becomes felt on a visceral level. A tightening in the chest, a heaviness in the gut, an emptiness they can't fill with distraction. That's not indifference. That's suppressed grief surfacing. They begin to sense that something important is missing. The emotional stability they thought they didn't need starts to haunt them. They remember the moments you brought warmth, understanding, and safety. They remember your presence in ways they didn't appreciate before. And now, without it, they feel a void that nothing else can fill. This is where the truth begins to emerge, the realization that love, no matter how frightening, gave them something structure could never provide: connection, belonging, and meaning. Your absence becomes a teacher. It teaches them that emotional loss is not avoidable. It's part of being human. It shows them that avoiding connection doesn't erase pain, it only postpones it. The deeper this realization sinks in, the more the avoidant starts to feel the consequences of their detachment. They may notice a growing sense of regret, even if they can't express it. They may catch themselves thinking about you at unexpected times, remembering small details, missing things they never thought they'd miss. The way you laughed, the tone of your voice, the energy you carried when you entered a room, these moments replay in their mind like echoes. What once felt overwhelming now feels irreplaceable. This is emotional loss transforming into awareness. The mind that once said, "I don't need them," begins to whisper, "What if I do?" But because avoidants are not comfortable with emotional exposure, they often resist this awareness. They may distract themselves with work, with new relationships, with solitude. They might tell themselves that this feeling will pass, that it's temporary, yet deep down, the fear doesn't fade. It grows. It grows because silence leaves no escape. Every time they try to suppress their emotions, the absence reminds them. Every time they try to rationalize, the emptiness contradicts their logic. Every time they convince themselves that they're fine, a wave of unease proves otherwise. That's the paradox of avoidance. The harder they try to escape loss, the more present it becomes. Your absence becomes the mirror that reveals the wound. It exposes the fear they've been carrying. The fear of needing someone and being left, the fear of opening up and being hurt, the fear of being seen and rejected. When you step away, those fears no longer hide beneath control. They stand naked in silence. The avoidant starts to realize that loss isn't just about missing someone. It's about confronting the truth that they've denied love its full expression. They begin to feel the consequences of emotional distance in a way that words can't soften. And while they may not reach out, while they may not express it openly, inside something is shifting. The loss that once terrified them is now teaching them. It's showing them that emotions, though painful, are real. It's showing them that control can't shield them from heartache. It's showing them that vulnerability, though risky, is the only path to genuine connection. This internal awakening may be subtle, even silent, but it's powerful. Because for the avoidant, realizing that they can lose something meaningful is the first step toward understanding how deeply they can feel. Your absence becomes the proof of their capacity for emotion. It breaks the illusion that they are detached or indifferent. It forces them to see that their heart is not immune to love and that their mind cannot outthink emotional truth. The pain they feel, the unease they carry, the emptiness they sense, all of it points to something real they cared, they connected, they felt. And even if they can't say it, even if they fight it, that truth begins to rewrite the story they've been telling themselves for years, that they don't need anyone, that they're better alone, that detachment equals safety. In silence, they learn that safety isn't found in distance. It's found in connection, and the fear of emotional loss becomes the doorway to discovering its space forces self-reflection and emotional awareness. For most avoidants, space has always been their refuge, their escape hatch from emotional intensity. They retreat when things get too close, when conversations touch the raw edges of their past, when vulnerability starts to surface and feels like danger instead of connection. They tell themselves they just need space to think, to breathe, to calm down. But what they really mean, often without realizing it, is that they need space to avoid feeling. Avoidants have spent years, sometimes decades, perfecting the art of emotional disconnection. They've learned to survive by controlling their exposure to emotion. But when space is no longer chosen by them, when it's created by you through no contact, that same space becomes something entirely different. It becomes reflection instead of avoidance. It becomes the quiet room where the noise of denial fades and self-awareness begins to rise. When you were present, when you were reaching out, when you were trying to bridge the emotional gap, the avoidant could keep running. They could keep hiding behind business, behind cold logic, behind dismissive behavior. Your constant effort allowed them to maintain the illusion that everything was under control. But when you withdraw, when communication stops, the silence becomes unavoidable. There's no conversation to escape from, no messages to ignore, no reassurance to deflect. The space becomes still, and in that stillness, reflection begins to creep in. For someone who's spent their life outrunning emotional truth, that stillness feels uncomfortable, almost unbearable. But it's also the very thing that starts their awakening. At first, the avoidant may convince themselves that this space is what they wanted all along. They might tell themselves that they're fine, that they needed a break, that this is peace. They may feel temporary relief because the emotional demands have lifted. But as time passes, that relief turns into restlessness. The thoughts they used to drown out with distraction start to surface. The questions they've avoided start to echo louder. Why did they feel the need to pull away? Why did they react with defensiveness instead of vulnerability? Why does this silence feel heavier than it should? These questions don't arrive as logic. They arrive as sensations, as emotions, as discomfort that refuses to be silenced. This is the power of space. It removes the external noise that lets avoidance thrive and replaces it with the internal voice they've been muting. That voice is quiet but persistent. It's the voice that remembers the warmth of connection, the depth of moments they tried to minimize, the safety they felt but couldn't admit. It whispers truths they've been too afraid to acknowledge, that they cared more than they showed, that they pushed away someone who truly saw them, that their independence has been a shield rather than a strength. Space turns avoidance into confrontation, not with another person, but with themselves. As the avoidant sits in that stillness, emotional awareness begins to take root. They start to feel the subtle energy shifts inside, the tension that rises when they think of what was lost, the unease that comes when they realize how disconnected they've been not just from others, but from themselves. The space doesn't punish them, it reveals them. It strips away the excuses, the defenses, the patterns of emotional withdrawal. It brings them back to the reality of their own humanity, the need for connection, for love, for emotional safety. For the first time, they begin to notice that their detachment hasn't protected them from pain, it has only prolonged it. Avoidants often fear emotion because they associate it with danger. Somewhere in their story, emotions became linked to chaos, rejection, or shame. They learn to regulate their world by controlling how much they feel. But space disrupts that control. When there's no one left to project onto, no conflict to hide behind, no emotional chaos to deflect, they're left with themselves. That's when the awareness starts to rise in small but powerful ways. They notice that their thoughts circle back to you. They find themselves recalling conversations, remembering details, feeling things they thought they buried. They might even feel anger or defensiveness toward your silence, not because of you, but because that silence exposes the parts of themselves they've denied. It's in that exposure that emotional awareness begins to grow. Awareness doesn't come through comfort, it comes through discomfort. It comes when the avoidant realizes that silence feels heavy because it's filled with emotions they've never processed. It comes when they understand that needing someone isn't weakness, it's humanity. The space forces them to sit with their internal contradictions, their desire for love and their fear of it, their craving for closeness and their instinct to run from it. Every day in that space deepens their awareness. Whether they admit it or not, they start to sense the emotional truth beneath their patterns, that their avoidance has cost them connection, and that the very space they use for safety has also become their cage. Through this reflection, subtle shifts begin to happen. The avoidant may start to see themselves differently. They might begin to question the stories they've believed for so long. Stories like, I'm better off alone. I don't need anyone. Love always leads to pain. Space begins to challenge those narratives, not through confrontation, but through experience. Because in the silence, they begin to feel what aloneness truly is, not independence, but isolation. They start to see the difference between peace and emptiness. What once felt like freedom starts to feel like confinement. And that shift is where awareness deepens. Avoidants aren't heartless, they're self-protective. But space has a way of softening those defenses over time. As the days stretch on and the silence continues, their emotional world begins to thaw. The numbness starts to crack. The emptiness they've relied on for safety becomes unbearable. They begin to notice how much of their identity was built around avoidance, and how exhausting that truly is. The reflection that space provides becomes undeniable. They start to see their patterns, their fears, and the consequences of their detachment with clarity they've never had before. It's not an easy realization. It's raw, confronting, and deeply uncomfortable. But it's also transformative. They begin to recognize that self-awareness isn't something they can think their way into. It's something they have to feel. They begin to see that their emotions, once perceived as threats, are actually signals pointing them toward healing. They start to understand that space doesn't have to mean distance. That solitude can be used not to escape feelings, but to process them. And this is where growth begins. For the first time, they start to connect the dots between their past and their present, between the wounds they've carried and the choices they've made. In that reflection, awareness turns into accountability. The avoidant begins to take emotional ownership, even if silently. They may not reach out, they may not say the words, but inside they begin to understand their role in the disconnect. They see how fear dictated their reactions, how pride silenced their heart, how control kept them from experiencing real intimacy. They begin to see that the very thing they feared most, emotional exposure, is the thing that leads to freedom. The awareness becomes a kind of awakening, slow and quiet, but powerful enough to shift everything they once believed about themselves and about love. That's what space does when you hold it. It transforms avoidance into awakening. It turns silence into reflection. It takes someone who's been hiding from their emotions and gently, sometimes painfully, brings them back to themselves. The awareness that arises from that process doesn't happen overnight, but it's lasting. Because once an avoidant starts to see themselves clearly, once they feel the truth of their emotions instead of running from them, they can't unseen it. Space becomes the doorway that leads them from denial to discovery, from self-protection to self-awareness, and from avoidance to the first real glimpse of emotional freedom. Your silence reclaims your power and resets the dynamic. For so long, you may have been the one giving, explaining, reaching out, trying to make things right while the other person pulled away. You tried to meet them where they were, to understand their distance, to soften their resistance. You thought that if you loved harder, they would open up. If you were patient enough, they would finally see your worth. But every time you did, you gave away a piece of your power. You placed your peace in someone else's hands, waiting for them to respond, to care, to choose you back. When you finally go silent, that energy shifts completely. The moment you stop chasing, you stop operating from lack and start operating from strength. You stop saying, please see me, and start saying, I see myself. Silence becomes the moment you take back what was always yours, your energy, your peace, your self-worth. When you go silent, it's not about ignoring someone, it's about honoring yourself. It's about stepping away from a dynamic that was draining your emotional reserves. Avoidants thrive in control. They feel safe when you're reacting. When they know you'll be there no matter how much distance they create, they subconsciously rely on your persistence because it allows them to keep their emotional defenses up without facing the consequences of their avoidance. But when that stops, when you stop reaching out, when your phone stays silent, when your energy is no longer centered around them, they feel the shift. The control they thought they had begins to dissolve. The power dynamic resets itself, not because you're trying to manipulate it, but because you're no longer participating in their pattern. Your silence sends a message words never could. It says, I'm done playing the role you wrote for me. It's a declaration of emotional independence. You're not withdrawing to punish them. You're withdrawing to protect your peace. You're stepping back not to create fear, but to create balance. The energy exchange that was once one-sided starts to even out. The avoidant, used to being the emotional anchor, while you carried the weight of connection, suddenly finds the ground shifting beneath them. The pattern they depended on disappears, and they're left with space they didn't anticipate. That space creates awareness, an awareness that you are no longer emotionally accessible on demand, that your presence was not guaranteed, that your love was not an endless resource. Silence is powerful because it forces clarity. When you stop explaining yourself, people have to sit with the truth of their actions. When you stop chasing, they have to confront what they've lost. For the avoidant, this realization cuts deep. They built their identity around control, believing they could push and pull you at will, believing you would always return no matter how distant they became. But silence breaks that illusion. It shows them that the emotional safety net they took for granted is gone. It reveals that the connection they thought they controlled was, in reality, a shared experience, one that only existed because you kept showing up. The moment you reclaim your power, everything changes. You stop reacting to their behavior and start responding to your own needs. You stop living in the emotional past and start standing in the present. That's where your strength lies, not in trying to make them understand you, but in understanding yourself. Silence gives you that space. It brings you back to center. It teaches you that you don't have to fight for connection to be worthy of love. You don't have to chase someone to prove your value. Your worth isn't determined by who stays. It's revealed by how you rise when someone doesn't. The dynamic resets because energy always seeks balance. For so long, the avoidant held emotional control by keeping you uncertain, by keeping you waiting, by keeping you hoping. Your silence removes that imbalance. When you no longer respond, their control mechanism fails. The uncertainty they once placed on you now returns to them. They start to question, to wonder, to feel the discomfort they once projected onto you. It's not revenge. It's equilibrium. It's the natural law of emotional energy, which you withdraw from others, they must eventually confront within themselves. In that silence, the avoidant begins to feel the ripple effect of your detachment. They sense that something has shifted, something subtle but undeniable. Your energy is no longer reaching toward them, and even though they may not admit it, they feel it. That feeling stirs something they've long suppressed: curiosity, reflection, maybe even regret. They start to realize that your presence brought stability, warmth, and meaning. And now, in your absence, they begin to grasp the weight of what they lost. The dynamic that once kept them safe in control now leaves them isolated in silence. Your silence doesn't just reset the connection. It resets you. It brings your focus back to where it belongs, on yourself. It allows you to rebuild the relationship that matters most, the one you have with your own spirit. You start to remember who you were before the overthinking, before the emotional chasing, before the waiting for validation. You reconnect with your own voice, your own rhythm, your own power. You realize that peace doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from mastering your energy. You start to feel lighter, stronger, freer. What used to drain you now empowers you. When you stop speaking into someone else's silence, you start hearing your own truth louder. You begin to recognize that silence is not empty. It's full of answers. It's where healing happens. It's where you start to separate love from attachment, compassion from self-sacrifice, and understanding from overextension. You begin to see that you never needed to prove your worth to someone who was too afraid to see it. You start to see that your silence is not rejection, it's redirection. You're no longer pouring energy into a space that doesn't pour back into you. The power of silence lies in what it creates inside you. It creates distance, yes, but that distance allows perspective. It gives you room to see the dynamic for what it truly was. It helps you understand where you gave too much, where you lost yourself, where you confused love with effort. And as you gain clarity, your energy begins to shift. You stop wanting to be understood by them, and you start desiring to understand yourself. You stop waiting for them to reach out, and you start reaching within. That's what reclaiming your power looks like. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's grounded. Your silence doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you started caring about yourself too. It's not indifference. It's self-respect. It's not the absence of emotion. It's the presence of boundaries. It's a declaration that you will no longer negotiate your peace to earn someone else's comfort. And that's where the dynamic truly resets. Because when you stand in your power, everything around you starts to adjust to that vibration. The avoidant who once felt safe in distance begins to feel your absence as disruption. The silence they once controlled becomes a mirror reflecting their own emotional limitations. They start to feel the discomfort that used to belong to you. This shift doesn't happen overnight, but it's inevitable. Energy always finds balance. And as your silence grows stronger, clearer, more aligned with your self-worth, the universe responds accordingly. People either rise to meet you at that frequency or fade away because they can't sustain it. Either way, you win. You win because your silence is not about loss. It's about alignment. It's about remembering that your voice doesn't have to be heard to have power, that your energy doesn't have to chase to create impact, that your love doesn't have to be proven to be real. Your silence becomes your greatest statement. It tells the world, I know my worth. It tells the avoidant, I won't play small to make you comfortable. It tells your own heart, I am enough. And that's when the dynamic truly resets, not because you forced it to, but because you evolved beyond it. Silence becomes the bridge between who you were and who you are becoming. And in that bridge, power returns to where it always belonged, with you